Hello and welcome. If you're watching this, I'm going to go ahead and make a couple of assumptions that you have some idea of what Warhammer is, what this ridiculous controversy is going to be about, and some of the things that have happened here recently. So before we begin, I believe that in order to properly and fairly discuss any controversial topic, it's important that we understand both sides of the argument. I am a rationalist through and through. I believe that overly emotional responses are both illogical and detrimental. I believe if you're going to have an opinion and you're going to have a voice about a topic that causes people to be upset, you owe it to your fellow human beings to be at least aware of what it is about this topic that's upsetting people from both sides. And I believe the biggest problem we have as a species right now is that everything is extreme. It's always you're with us or you're against us. This kind of environment where growth and understanding simply cannot exist. I think in most cases, if someone feels strongly about a topic, somewhere in their argument for why they feel strongly about that topic, there is a point. And if you're going to attempt to change the heart or mind of people and produce value in an opinion, you must address the points made by the opposition of your stance, whatever your stance is going to be. Make sure you're educated and aware of your own stance. But if you're going to argue a topic and you're going to try to ignore why the opposition is upset on the topic, then you're wasting time. I believe very strongly that broad world building is critical to a setting. So much so that my favorite game, One Page Rules, my biggest critique was when they were paper thin and hard to find bits of lore and world building. They had a beautiful system and fantastic perspective on how to operate with their fan base, but they didn't actually have much of a setting yet. Now, they're currently working on that, and I am as excited as anyone to see what comes from it, and I truly believe that they will be a better company for it. I believe that having a world in which factions exist that are unpopular or directly counterculture is fantastic. The entire point of fiction is to create things that are not real, create things that are unfair, uneven, abhorrent, or despicable, because that creates conflict and gives a meaningful narrative drive. So the topic of today is, as you know, Games Workshop and their recent bizarre choices. So let's start with the most likely reason you've clicked on this video, the female custodian. So, ironically, the biggest problem here isn't what they did, but how they did it. Games Workshop as a company is a publicly traded company, and they could easily have sidestepped most, if not all, of this trouble if they had simply made an announcement to all of their fan base saying something to the akin of, all of these super soldiers are so genetically modified that we don't even consider them to have a gender anymore. They're not human. But because it was more easily narrative to assign them a gender, so it would be easier for the fans to read, we are now going to go back and reassign all of them, being essentially as nothing about them was designed with gender or reproduction in mind. They could have easily said, we're going to add some new lore and make it more inclusive because it didn't make sense that we've created a faction that represents the best of humankind and gender excluded it. So with that in mind, we'll be adding stories of female custodians or the identified, for the reader's convenience, female custodian. This would have sidestepped so much of this unnecessary drama and so much of this unnecessary baggage, but produced a similar or the same result. It's staggering to me that no one thought of this. You have a $1 billion company, one of the largest entertainment companies on the planet for this market, and you're going to make a change to the fundamental understanding of how your audience interacts with your product. And rather than acknowledging the change and having an open and honest discussion with your audience so that they understand what your intent is, you instead have chosen to essentially gaslight your audience, telling them that this is the way it has always been. This is insane. A few years ago, Games Workshops put out an inclusive space statement. They said that anyone who identifies in any way is welcome to play Warhammer, and if you are the type of person who would not welcome someone based on any of these identifiers, then you should not play Warhammer. Now, That is not exactly what I would call a bold or strong or brave stance. That is a basic human stance. But at the end of the day, some people got upset and there was a lot of pitter patter. And then everyone just moved on. Because the reality is it's a game and everyone can play it. And they can play whichever army they want. They can play in whichever way they want. It doesn't make sense either as a business or as a story to be exclusive. Ironically, the critical mistake I think here was allowing gender to be even a conversation for these mutant aberrants that are so far from human that it's really not even parallel to the human race anymore. That, I think, was their biggest mistake. We've acknowledged for years that after the modifications and the bizarre things that are done to these Space Marines, they are not men anymore. Not in any sense that makes any difference. So why it matters whether you identify them as male or female is truly bizarre. Because the reality is that if you had a female that was turned into a Space Marine, it would likely look exactly like every other Space Marine, because nothing about being female would survive the process any more than anything about being male survives the process. That is kind of the point that was originally brought up the first time this controversy came up, and whenever someone's arguing about the whole female Space Marine. And if you're wondering how we got to female Space Marines, trust me when I say that the group of people who are upset about this are upset for one of two reasons. They're either upset because there is a huge 30-plus book library of lore that is being ignored and not even acknowledging that it's being ignored, and we're being gaslit to think that it has always been like this when it clearly has not. And instead of respecting us enough to tell us that they're retconning it and why, they're just going to push the narrative as if it had always been like that and this is something wrong with us. The other group of people who are upset about this are upset because they believe that this is Games Workshop's attempt to test the water so that they can push for having the female Space Marine. Now, why does the female Space Marine even matter? So I'm actually adding a part post-edit with this because I've seen this argument come up a couple of times and I want to make sure that I'm addressing all of the arguments that are being brought against this. There is this bizarre sexist argument, and I'm calling it sexist, and I'm going to explain why here in just a second, of it doesn't make sense to give your best weapons to anyone but your strongest and your best, and men are stronger, therefore it makes more sense to give it to men. This argument is so... I pick and choose what part of the actual biology and the science I want, and I ignore the rest. This is the equivalent of the Bible says that homosexuality is wrong, but then ignoring the entire section shortly after that about buying slaves. You cannot just pick and choose what part of this you want to keep and ignore the rest. It either all matters or none of it matters. Now, is there an argument that men by and large tend to be more physically strong? Absolutely. There's also an argument to be said that women tend to be tougher. You know what that argument is? Pregnancy. Pregnancy is an example of women being genetically tougher. And I don't care what anyone says. I've got kids. I've watched the process from start to finish. Women are tougher. Why does either of these things matter when you're going to genetically modify someone to the point where they're not even going to be recognizable as a human being anymore? That's the real question. Because the idea here is that they are making genetic superhumans. It doesn't matter if you are 1% stronger, because once you're done the process of being modified, that 1% will no longer exist, because they're going to push you to the absolute limits of what the species, not the sex, the species is capable of. So a genetically modified female and a genetically modified male, neither of them being human anymore, will both be exactly the same because you have, again, modified them. I don't understand this bizarre, I like this part of science, so I'm going to include it, but I'm going to ignore the rest of it that everyone seems to cling on to. I love this hobby and I love this lore, and I really, really, really don't want to continue to have the people who think like this be the voice that is given out to, because it's giving all of us a bad look, and you're fueling all of the arguments that Games Workshop and companies like it are using to justify this bizarre pro-woke attitude. You keep arguing and bitching and whining to the rooftops about how it's wokehammer and everyone's woke and woke and woke and woke, but at the same time you're peddling these sexist, simple-minded arguments that have no basis in actual anything. They're just bits and pieces of things that you like, so you're using it to justify why you think you're better, and you need to stop, because until you stop, there's going to be an argument for woke, because woke is simply pointing at things that you're doing and saying, well, look, he literally just says, oh, they're just stronger, so they're just better, so they should be the best. And as long as you keep giving woke activists ammunition like this, you can't expect them to stop, because normal people who don't know either way are going to look at what you said and look at it being pointed at and go, well, they have a point. If you want woke to stop giving woke room to live. In fact, just as a thought, why not find ways for these things to exist within the lore without destroying it? Give them a way in. Things like Sweet Baby Inc. Detected work because they are taking away the bullshit and holding people accountable. Stop adding bullshit and hold people accountable. It's really that simple. This woke that you're so afraid of only works because nobody wants to be rational and hold them accountable for what they are doing, while simultaneously not proving them right. That's the end of the additional editorial. Back to the video. It matters for a couple of reasons. Space Marines are at the core the poster child for this game. So their look, their appearance, their armor, it is all market researched. They have actually said that the reason Space Marines and Stormcast were picked as the centerpiece and the front and center for this brand is because painting skin is hard. So they give you options to do it in small amounts or not do it at all. So what happens if they have a female Space Marine? Well, nothing. Assuming that they do it with any ounce of realistic and within their own lore considerations, it will look exactly the same. But there are people out there who see their masculinity in the Marines, because the Marines have always been a masculine device, narratively, and they fear that the idea of adding any amount of femininity to that or any amount of ambiguity to that would create a non-masculine space, and that is a problem for some folks. I think that the other underlying problem here is that this all falls into what is at the moment a huge talking point of, is forced inclusionary efforts actually inclusive? Now, what does that mean? That means if you take a white character and turn them black, are you being inclusive to black people? My favorite example of this is the Thor Ragnarok character that was originally white and turned black, and it raised a lot of eyebrows because within the setting they had, it didn't make sense, and nothing about this written white, designed white, acted white character that was now black represented them actually being black. There was nothing about this character that accurately or honestly or with any amount of sincerity included a minority. It was just a character who had been washed to a different color. And if you had flipped the perspective and had a game where a black person was turned white but nothing else was changed, it would have been considered a huge social problem. But for some reason, this one wasn't until gamers got involved. This is the kind of thing that makes the forced diversifying of culture a problem, because if you're not creating a character from the ground up that has their diverse nature from whatever the norm for that world is baked into their core, all you have done is applied a coat of paint to a thing that already exists, and it's not doing any favors to anyone. So it was my opinion when another good example, the Spider-Man games came out and Miles was created. A lot of folks were like, well, they're just making a black Peter Parker. And it's like, well, there's an argument to that, I suppose, but if you look at Miles as a character on his own merits, he's fantastic. He is a breath of fresh air, and people love him, and they love him because he wasn't Peter Parker turned black. He was a whole new character who happened to also be black, and that is the difference here. What at their core, I think, the people who aren't terrible people but are upset about this are worried about is that Games Workshop, like so many other companies, is going to attempt to force change that is not going to actually be authentic or serious in any way, shape, or form. It's going to be skin deep. It's going to pollute and dilute the quality of the world, and it's not going to make it better for anyone. At the core, the biggest problem here, the core problem here is that Games Workshop as a company chose to handle this in the same way that an angry child might have handled not liking the news that they were given. It's childish to think that you can do all of these things and change all of this lore in the current zeitgeist, the way the media is, the way that the world is right this moment in 2024, with all the focus on diversity, inclusion, with LGBT, gay, black, Latino. Everybody is in a conversation about how do we become more inclusive. If you thought that you were going to slip something in during this time period, you are out of your mind, and you deserve the backlash that you're getting. Not because what you did was wrong, but because the way that you chose to do it was abhorrent. You should be ashamed. I am ashamed for you. It would not have been that hard to just say, we are going to retcon this to be more inclusive. You also could have gone the other route, which would have been infinitely easier, and said, okay, as of today, there are rumors that the need for Space Marines, the need for Chaos Marines, the need for Custodians and Grey Knights is so great that they have discovered a way to make any human a functioning member of those groups. You have Basilius Claw, I'm sorry, I'm bad at his name, and you have Fabius Bile. There's absolutely nothing stopping you from saying, okay, from this point on, we have decided that the lore is going to say, the war has gotten bad, we're desperate, we need anybody that we can get, everybody with a vagina, you're going in the vat. You're going to turn into a Space Marine, we're not even going to try anymore, everybody goes in. That fixes the problem, that makes sense within the setting, that includes you some options to expand outward, and it took me 10 seconds. It wasn't hard, and it doesn't have anything on the surface that stops it from being accepted into all of the currently accepted lore. Custodians might have been a little bit of a problem. That's fair because of the way they were made, but you made the lore, and now the Custodians are out and about, and you got your Emperor character kind of out and about, and make some more. The problem with retroactively making something diverse is because it was never designed to be that kind of diverse in the beginning, so just make something new. Make something new and bake the diversity that you want so that you can get the credit for it into it so that it makes sense and is actually respectful to the groups of people you hope to represent. Because don't let me make this point any less important than it is. Diversity is fantastic and important, and it needs to be authentic because people deserve better. If you are in a group of people and you identify as a minority, you should have a representation, and your representation should be honest and earnest. It should be made from the ground up to make sure that you have a voice and your voice makes sense. It should not have been baked into with fear or hate mongering. It should not be baked into a political ideology. It should not be baked into an agenda that people are using to line their pockets. And that's the problem here. And that's the problem nobody seems to want to talk about, because there's a lot of money being exchanged. And there's a lot of groups getting paid a lot of money to just kind of surface fix this problem and say, hey, okay, well, we signed off on it and we're this minority, so now it's okay. That is the exact problem that we have, and it needs to stop. It's not fair that a company like Games Workshop has to do any of this, but the reality of the world that we currently live in is that they chose to be a publicly traded company, and as soon as they chose to become publicly traded, they opened themselves up to all kinds of bullshit, and this is one of them. You chose to take money from investors who have agendas, and now you have to deal with it, and there's nothing you can do about that. But here's the thing. You're in a space, there's nothing you can do anymore. You have to make the best of it. And the best way to handle these things, and the best way to make things much easier, is to be transparent and honest with your fan base. Because that's the thing. Your fan base wants you to succeed when you treat them with respect, and you're not. People love stories where there are racist, bigoted groups. They love villains. All those things can exist, and you can still provide whatever level of inclusionary that you want, but you have to do it in a sincere and earnest way and stop just jumping on trends. If there's anything to take away from this video, I implore you, this is not a big deal. Even if they include diversity for diversity's sake and they create subpar factions and par things, hold them to task. Hold them to task for lying and gaslighting you. Hold them to task for taking the easy way out and trying to duck a controversy. Hold them to task for having put their company in a position where other people get to tell them what to do and what is right and what is wrong. But don't let yourself fall into these insane groups that think that the law is changing, the lore is changing, and that just because Games Workshop is trying to do what they think is right and produce opportunities for peoples of different sets to see something closer to themselves within the mutant super warriors, don't let that make you into a shit person. Doing the right thing for the wrong reason is still notable and there still has the right outcome, but having the wrong way about it should be called out. It doesn't mean the outcome isn't what we should have been with all the insanity and all the things Games Workshop has done, but it's not worth being upset at them about it and how they handled it. Just make the distinction. We're better than that. The hobby is better than that. Do not let yourself fall into one of these groups who has turned this into a joke, that this is some kind of woke nightmare. Do not allow extremists to take a normal person with normal thoughts and understanding, and you are smart enough, you are intelligent enough, you have capacity and empathy enough enough to understand there is a middle ground between these groups of people. We do not have to make everything 100% inclusionary for everyone, and that is okay. We do not have to make everything not inclusive for anyone. That is also okay. Be better. Be in the middle. Refuse to be an extremist. With all the love in my world, Dorkness Inc. out.